Hello and welcome back to our 10th instalment of our journey through the Oracle of the Hekatean Path, and we're kind of almost there, aren't we?
Yeah, not long to go now before we get to the end.
We're on number 10. Part 11 will be this is the next 5 cards 49 to 54. Part 11 will be the remaining 5 cards, and then our final video will be, actually I've got my numbers mixed up, I can't remember whether it's, anyway, whichever. Our final one will be basically some practical tips for putting the deck to use. So welcome anyway. It's lovely to see you back, and we're going to start with card 49, which is Artemis.
Yes.
You've subtitled this Independence, haven't you?
Yeah, and I think anybody that's even sort of vaguely familiar with the mythology of Artemis as a goddess understands that, she was an independent goddess because, at base level, she didn't marry, she didn't have, a relationship structure with, in the same sort of, in the patriarchal system. She didn't want any of that. She wanted to do the boys' things. She wanted to be independent. She wanted to do what she wanted to do. And so obviously, Zeus allows that, and everybody respects it. And obviously in antiquity, there is the conflation between Hecate and Artemis that crops up quite often. And actually, genealogically speaking, Hecate and Artemis are actually cousins.
Ah, okay.
Because Hecate's mother, Asteria, her sister was Leto, who was the mother of Artemis and Apollo. So, they have these links beyond just what, conflation that happened in later antiquity. In a genealogical sense, they were part of this, extensive, extended family.
Yeah.
And they came to share a lot of attributes. So obviously, their connection to the moon, symbols such as like dogs carrying torches.
Yeah.
This sense of independent, self-governing, womanhood. They're often referred to as virgins or maidens, but not strictly in how we interpret those sort of roles today. We assume that a virgin is somebody that hasn't had sex, and while that is still probably it's alluded to, it's more to do with the fact that they just don't get betrothed and fed into this patriarchal system of basically being property of their husbands.
That's also, it's funny because our concept of virginity is a relatively modern construct, isn't it? Because even if you look at our culture in the Middle Ages, the European culture in the Middle Ages, their concept of virginity was more akin to the one that you're talking about than the one that we have now. And it's a word unfortunately, it's a word that comes with a lot of connotations that we take for granted that have to be looked past when you're looking this far back into history, isn't it?
Yeah, and obviously to bring her into this deck was again a bit of a no-brainer, but I wasn't 100% sure how I was gonna, or how I wanted to sort of represent her without sort of, I suppose, falling into those tropes again of being either overly dependent on this notion of the huntress. But then we found this really nice marble statue of I think it's depicted as Diana, but obviously there are similarities between Artemis and Diana. And I just got this notion of, because we often represent the new moon as sometimes being referred to as Diana's bow and Diana's crescent, and so I got this idea of isolating the bow that the statue had and then trying to sort of illuminate it in this very lunar fashion. And just the fact that she's standing very prominent in the center of this, what for all interpretation is a sort of very dark wooded glade.
Yeah.
And in her in this in this aspect of the statue, in the statue's nudity and stuff, it's not a sexual thing. It's an empowering thing where basically she answers to nobody but herself, and she exudes this power and this ability to just self-govern and be as good as any man, if not better. And I think especially for a lot of people these days, to have that sort of self-belief and self-worth and that independence to do what is best for you by it's not an easy thing to do, because you've always got somebody trying to either talk you out of it or getting you to do something that they want to do. So I think Artemis can definitely be invoked in this image and this in this deck as the spearhead for basically saying, yeah, you do you don't have to answer to anybody.
I think it's also, I mean, if I drew this in a reading, it would immediately take me into a place of trust in my own judgment more. In any given situation, there's something. It's a very peaceful card on some levels, but on another, you just think her energy is just so completely self-apparent. But it's a very, I mean, visually, it's very understated, and yet it just has such a positive message.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you were talking about like the conflation of Hecate and Artemis, and the sort of crossover. But would I be right in assuming that it's very rare that the sort of crone aspect would be attributed to Artemis in the way that it is to Hecate?
I mean, that in itself is a whole completely different can of worms, because obviously there is no ancient precedent for any of that, any chronal aspect in relation to Hecate. Hecate was always depicted as a maiden, and even in her triple form, they were all the same age, and they were usually, young women or women up to a certain age. There was never any sort of depiction of age in the respect that we would understand it. The Greeks, they viewed their gods largely as perfect and sort of at the pinnacle of their human their human anthropomorphized form. So they were often very well built and very well in proportioned and things like that. And then it's only when you get certain other deities like Hephaestus that has the lame leg, and sometimes it's referred to as being a bit more deformed. There's usually a reasoning behind that has a sort of socio-political reasoning behind it. Using Hephaestus as an example, some view it as the fact that Hera tried to have a child without Zeus's involvement, in the same way that Zeus produced Athena, who was this glorious, perfectly formed goddess of wisdom. And so in some versions of the myth, when Hera tries to do the same, she ends up with Hephaestus, and she's not happy with him. So she basically throws him off Mount Olympus as a baby, because she's, basically just chucking the rubbish out. And that leads to him, being broken and deformed. And then there's more myths that happen where he grows up and sort of tries to get his own back on her, and then they sort of reconcile and so on. So the whole crone thing is one of those things that it's a modern application towards Hecate, especially when viewed as a triple goddess. It tends to be that people look at sort of Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate as a triple, but then there is occasion where Hecate, Artemis, and Selene are conflated together as this triple goddess. But again, there's no actual reference to an age difference or a chronal aspect. It's just that they represent the phases of the moon.
Right.
So Diana is the new moon, or Artemis is the new moon. Selene is the full moon, and then Hecate is the dark moon. And it's only later, through varying sort of influences, that kind of lay this crone aspect, you know, on the mantle of Hecate. And to be honest, it was something I thought about maybe including in the deck to be a bit the devil's advocate, but then I kind of chose not to in the end, because I just wanted to focus on, you know, the richness of the actual history.
What actually is there?
Yeah.
Well, I've learned something new today, because that's just something I took for granted and never thought to question it. So you live and learn. Should we go on to number 50?
Yes. So
this was another early one, and visually I love it. It's just it makes me feel good. It's fun. It's happy. It's vibrant. So this is Dionysus, and you've subtitled this the card of ecstasy.
Yeah. And again, that's, you know, that's a word that's different understanding depending on what your backgrounds and things. But the actual root of the word ecstasy comes from the ancient Greek ekstasis, which is about basically being moved by a god, or in this respect by Dionysus. So, you know, those revelrous forms of worship where you lose yourself, and you know, you don't, either you exist outside of yourself or you were taken over by the spirit of this revelry and this ecstasis. That is where it all comes from. It's the god residing inside you, and sort of, you know, you throwing off fetters of constraint and social, you know, social forms. And that was very much what Dionysus was as a sort of religious figure. He was this outsider that came along and kind of shook everything up. And you know, there were times where in cities they didn't particularly like that type of worship. But, you know, over the years, especially in the Roman times, you know, the bacchanals and stuff, they were banned, but they still went on. That, you know, because it was something people enjoyed. It was something that people got something from it, you know, rather than what we assume as it's just debauchery and drunkenness and, you know, and all of those, I suppose, negatively interpreted things.
Yeah.
And
I presume that it was kind of ritualized debauchery. That was always my presumption. You know?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's probably bound to have been times where people were just doing it for having for the sake of having a good party. But, you know, on the properly, especially again within mystery traditions and things like that, it was all about a religious, you know, there was a religious element to it. And I kind of wanted to include Dionysus in this deck because although they don't really have any recorded they don't really appear together much in antiquity. There is just something very, there's a lot of parallels between the two of them. That, you know, obviously Hecate being quite a liminal goddess and existing in all these different in-between places, and then Dionysus being this one that can create those liminal things where things are neither one thing nor another, where he's not, you know, he's not constrained by, you know, constructs that would, you know, man-made constructs, social, you know, societal constructs. So he's very much capable of breaking things down. I often refer to him as the renderer and the revealer.
Yeah, because I suppose he's very much, in a way, a god of positive chaos, isn't he? When you think about it.
I mean, there's an adage about how obviously the Greeks viewed drinking like wine and drinking socially, and basically I mean, they used to drink their wine diluted. So they used to cut it with water, and so rather than, you know, how we do, where we just neck a bottle straight away. But there was this thing that basically, I think it was 3 cups was kind of the limit. So you had one was for, I can't remember the exact order, but like one would be for you know, conversation, and one would be for, you know, a bit of a laugh and a joke, and one would be for some, you know, serious philosophical debate and things. But then once you got into the realms of the 4th cup and the 5th cup, you know, then that started to be people that were, you know, a pain in the arse or a bit of a lech and a complete drunken buffoon and stuff. So it was very much, there was still these ideas of rules, but it was very much a case of hard to pin him down. If he came to the party, then that's it, all bets are off, and you'll just have to see what happens in the morning when when the dust settles. But the fact that he has these initiatory and revelatory abilities, and he's very, very capable of shining lights into dark places, taking you to dark places to explore aspects of yourself that maybe you don't want to acknowledge, but in the same way that Hecate does that, through guidance and cord cutting and things like that, Dionysus is kind of almost tells you to sort of surrender to it, because
Dionysus actually is kind of, it's almost like surrendering to the rawest form of yourself, isn't it? I think if you're in the presence of a god like this, nothing is hidden or covered, or it's all stripped away, isn't it? And actually what is left there is just raw humanity, which is very challenging,
but there are occasions where if we don't interpret those those vulnerable exposures of this raw humanity, you can find an ecstasy in it. You can find a divine, providence in it. It is about surrender, and it's about trusting that the gods are doing things, or have orchestrated things in a way that is beneficial to you. If not readily apparent, but somewhere down the line. And even if this card comes up in a more sort of generic, mundane way, sometimes it is just about letting your hair down, maybe not necessarily breaking rules, but maybe bending them a little bit, just to be a bit more flexible, to be freer in yourself, to feel a bit more liberated, rather than
less inhibited.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, number 51. Hermes. Everyone will recognize this figure. I think the key word is quite straightforward, isn't it? Messages.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that's quite a literal interpretation of Hermes as a messenger god and a god of communication. And yet his links with Hecate come from, again, things like the Greek magical papyri, where they're both seen as these intermediaries that can move between realms. In certain translations of the myth of Demeter and Persephone, where Hecate is taken out of the equation, Hermes is put in her place as the one that sort of brings Persephone back and forth.
I didn't.
So forth.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I liked the fact that we found a really good image of a really good statue of. I think it's a more modern statue.
I think it's more of a sort of Victorian one, isn't it? Than
because it's on the front of a building somewhere.
It just summed the spirit of the card up, doesn't it? And certainly of what we needed. You know?
And as much as Hermes has his chthonic aspects, he is a psychopomp, the same as Hecate is. He can go to the underworld. I often see him a lot more area. And so obviously a lot more in the sort of more ethereal sort of realms of air and thought and things like that. So we kind of played with that, with the this cloudiness and these sort of grey, white, blue tones of light, and then obviously this lens flare of where he's standing.
To me, it was a kind of lovely sense of him either standing on a star or standing on the sun. But it really, I kind of loved that idea that you'd had, because it was very much, it kind of really gave him this quite heavenly feel, And I think I like this visually, because I think we really, it's kind of got a natural feel to it. one of the things I love about working with images of statues is that when you superimpose them into other images and impose colors on them, they stop looking like statues to a certain extent, you know. And if you can just get it right, they look really quite animated. I think that's what I loved about the Artemis card. Is, I mean, that is a very lifelike statue. And once we sort of got that image into the background and lit in the way we wanted to, they're kind of not quite there, but they're almost there. And I think we kind of achieved that, particularly with this one, you know. And it does have quite a Titanic feel to it, which I love, you know.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of, I'm just trying to remember which film it is. It's one of the older films.
The Argonauts.
Is it Jason and the Argonauts, where Hermes does grow and he's big, you know? Because that is a thing you do see in some ancient reliefs. Yeah. You see little plaques and friezes of people making offering to the gods, and the gods are always depicted as much bigger, you know, so you can tell who is a human and who is a god. And I just liked that aspect of it. So I thought, you know, we kind of inadvertently achieved that.
Tribute to it, didn't we? You know?
Yeah. And then obviously when when we're looking at this in relation to Hecate, there is a conflation of the two of Hecate and Hermes that's often referred to as Hermecate. So it's like the two conjoined. You've got kind of magician-esque aspects to Hermes as well. He can be a trickster, and both Hecate and Hermes were often represented by these. Obviously, Hermes had herms, which were like plinths with a head and sometimes like an erect phallus on, and then Hecate would sometimes have these columns that didn't really have like bodies, but they had like carved heads on. So they had these similar things, and they both had connections to pathways and roads and doorways and gates, and very much moving freely from one thing to another. So they do share quite a few very similar spheres of influence. And obviously, when we bring in the messages for this, this can be interpreted in so many different ways. It could be messages from the gods. It could be messages from spirit guides. Could be your Auntie Pam writing you a postcard from somewhere.
This is, I mean, in our deck, this is very much the equivalent in a Lenormand deck would be the letter card, wouldn't it? It's very much a message. Actually, the letter or the rider, because the letter card very much represents messages itself, whereas the rider card represents, somebody actively bearing a message to you. There's aspects of both in this, isn't there? But it's,
Yeah, I think if he shows up in a reading, it's definitely when you've kind of got to keep your ears open, for want of a better term and thing, because there is obviously some message or some sign or something that you've not quite taken notice of. And I think, again, that can be applied both mundanely, and spiritually at the same time. And I think there's no real better representation of that than Hermes, to be honest.
Now we're going to move on to a
okay, I like this one. This is one
of your favorites. This was fun to do. So, number 52, Kerberos, with actually, interestingly, with the keyword of obstacles.
Which it's not necessarily a keyword people want to find in a reading, but what I've kind of achieved with using more negative keywords in this deck is not to be looking at them at face value, but to actually be looking at them slightly differently. Another example will be when we get to the Clytius card, which is in a couple more. But for Kerberos, I definitely wanted to include him in this deck because obviously we've spoken before about obviously Hecate's connection with dogs and this the myth of Aconite springing up from Kerberos's saliva and such like that, and him being a guardian of the underworld. And I just had this sort of vision of the three-headed dog in a sort of fiery cavern. Obviously glowing eyes. You're not really going to want to deal with him. But obviously, then I got this notion of using chains in it. I often have this earworm of sort of the phrase Cerberus in chains, and I find it is it's kind of like quite a binding idea.
It is, and also, I mean, it wasn't anything surprising for me because, I mean, in the kind of all the popular culture where I've experienced, sort of images of Cerberus, is always been chained. But then, whether that's actually implicit in the ancient texts or not, I don't know. But there is this sense that, with a beast that ferocious, there has to be some kind of containment,
Yeah.
But then as well, I mean, the context that I've always come across Cerberus as this, as being as of a guard dog, So, I mean, even, in modern situations, most guard dogs are on chains, albeit ones that are the length or the radius of the area that they're guarding, But yeah.
Yeah, we found a really nice statue. Can't remember if it was a statue on its own or was it part of a fireplace mantle. I can't remember.
It was part of a sort of marble fireplace relief, but it kind of looked quite sedate until we kind of got colorizing and giving it like death glow eyes, didn't it?
Yeah, and I mean he literally came to life when we started sort of doing that with him and inverting the colours.
Yeah.
And obviously when we're looking at obstacles with this, it's more to do with. Excuse me, my cats are fighting. It's more to do with the nature of obstacles. Like you mentioned, like the guard dog, obviously Cerberus is guarding the underworld. And you read various myths and such, nobody is meant to go there unless they're meant to be going there, as in they've died and they're being taken. And it is very much a case of thinking about what is blocking your path, and is there a reasoning behind this blockage? Is it a self-imposed blockage? Is it one that's there spiritually, by Hecate's hand to, because you're not ready, like we mentioned in the mysteries card, if you're not ready to traverse that bit yet, you won't gain access. And then I started thinking about, obviously, when we spoke about the myth with the Aconite, obviously Hercules is pulling him out of the underworld by his chains, and so then we're thinking, well, so he had the necessary strength to surmount that obstacle and to pull him out and and achieve his labor and his whatever he was set out to do. So again, you're looking at it from both sides. You're looking at it as this insurmountable obstacle, but if you know the trick, or how to get around it, it's not a case of it being a completely immovable object.
Yes. Yeah. It's one of the scarier cards in the deck, I think, because people have preconceived ideas, and yet at the same time, I kind of started looking at this in a different way. Once we created this image, but from a practical point of view, it was one of the most fun ones to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, this one was fun. The next one. I think I mentioned when we did our introduction, this is kind of when you told me what we were doing with this, and I thought, oh wow, we've really lost it now. I'm doing zombies in a graveyard. But
yeah,
actually, as this unfolded and I started to realize just the ethos behind this, and I thought that it was visually one of the most fun ones to do, but it's also, to me, one of the most powerful ones in the deck, from a point of view of human existence and also from those we've lost, from the ancestors. So this is The Restless Dead, number 53, and you've subtitled this Unresolved Past.
Yeah, and I chose that because that is something that's we all experience. We all have unresolved things, whether they're minor issues or major traumas that kind of followed us down, through a family or whatever. And Hecate's relationship with this notion of the restless dead obviously comes from a more underworldly and darker aspect. And it was seen that, people that perhaps would, died untimely and didn't receive the proper burials, or, they might have died out on the road, been mugged and killed and just left in a ditch somewhere. So that's where you start to build this notion of places like crossroads and stuff becoming haunted, and this retinue of spirits kind of almost being scooped up by Hecate as she moves from from place to place. And then so they become this sort of unholy retinue of, I suppose, lives that were never necessarily lived to their fullest, and a train of regret and various things. Excuse the noise, that is the cats in a box.
I wondered.
They literally are doing everything they're not supposed to today. But yeah, when you take it on a sort of face value, it is one of those. But then there's a lot of symbolism within the ghosts of the past. And I think the interpretation of the image was, in a way, slightly literal, because it is a cemetery with all of these shades sort of standing around, looking as though they've all. Some of them are more distinct than others.
Yeah. But it's one of the things that I really appreciated about this, because, I think we could have gone two ways. We could have tried to give it an ancient slant, but the thing actually, I think of all the cards, this one is actually more contemporary. This is very recognizably a modern graveyard, but that's what actually really helped me to understand this. And I think as well, this has extra resonance for me now, having gone through probably the biggest personal bereavement possible last year when I lost my father. But it also, this card speaks to me of the damage that kind of unresolved issues, unresolved conversations, all of those sort of things can do, when you do lose someone. I was in a lucky position in that there was nothing left unsaid, and thankfully we had a good relationship, but losing him really made me realize that there are certain conversations that we will no longer have. There are things that I can't ask him anymore. And it's funny, every time I've looked at this card, it just brings me back to that point where I think, thank God we did have that good relationship, and that we did have all the conversations that we needed right up to literally the day that he passed away. And I think what this says to me, I think if this came up in a reading to me, it speaks to those relationships that weren't resolved, people that I have lost either through bereavement, or it's just, we're now no longer in contact, or we're separated. And it speaks to me very much about how those unresolved issues, we still carry them, even though, the dead, bless them, they're free of all of this. They have, freedom from kind of all of the strives that, that we're dealing with in early life, in earthly life. But we still carry it. And actually, for me, when this has come up in my readings, this has been very much about, well, okay, it's down to me to resolve that now. How do you see it?
Well, it's interesting. You met what you mentioned there about we are the ones that carry these specters, and the dead don't necessarily have to worry about any of those things. And I think that's quite telling as sort of again, I suppose, a modern and slightly Christian influenced way of thinking about the afterlife, because obviously to the ancient Greeks, their afterlife was pretty naff, to be honest, because even if you had the proper burials and all the rest of it, you were likely just to go to the underworld. And basically you just existed as a shade. You didn't particularly have form or substance or awareness. The only differences to that were the sort of heroes and very pious people that might have gone on to things like the Elysian Fields, where it was a lot more happier and nicer and eternal spring summer type or if you were completely, devoid of humanity, an absolute evil person, you might get thrown in Tartarus, which is even deeper
even
into
worse.
the underworld, and and you get a punishment in a similar concept to especially the medieval period of like thinking about hell. You think about things like Sisyphus and his stone. Those are all Tartaran punishments. So yeah, for the ancient Greeks, it was more about living a good life, and and then just hoping that I suppose if you died, you weren't going to die, in agony or be murdered or anything like that. But yeah, in a modern context, again, I think this will definitely be coloured by your views of an afterlife and and life after death, if you believe in such a thing. But then, like you say, you mentioned this notion of us carrying the spectres, and it's true. We've all got skeletons in closets.
Yeah.
And they might not necessarily be very dramatic when if you told somebody about them, they might just go, "Oh, is that it?"
Yeah, but for us, it's different, isn't it?
Yeah, because we've allowed them to, I suppose, haunt these corners of our lives and our minds and stuff. I suppose they can have more power than than they can, and I suppose that you can kind of interpret it that way, that these spectres, whether figurative or literal, only have the power that we give to them. And that's very telling in the ancient Greek view of these spirits of the dead, that in order to in practices of sort of magic that dealt with spirits of the dead, it was very much a case of you would summon these shades, but they wouldn't be able to do anything unless you did a certain ritual and gave them certain offerings for them to basically get a glimmer of their life back and a sense of awareness enough to communicate with you and say, and pass on whatever message. And usually that, it would be things like digging a pit and pouring into the pit sort of milk and honey and oatmeal, and then usually sacrificing an animal and letting the blood all pour into this this earthen trough, and then obviously you call the spirit up, and that spirit is then seen to consume this mixture of these varying life-giving elements, and then obviously for a period of time they become aware again. You can ask them whatever you're after, and then eventually they just go back to being a shade again, and they just they go back into the underworld. So yeah, I think it's if you can confront these spectres, I suppose that's the ultimate thing, isn't it? Are you going to leave things unresolved, or are you actually going to try and resolve them?
But this card, I think more than any other, it intrigues me because it works on so many different levels. And also what interests me about what you created here is that regardless of your spiritual worldview, this will still reverberate, as we've just shown, in different ways, depending on what your actual worldview and spirituality is.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of those things that, I mean, in this image, we kind of created more of a universal truth than we realized, because there's actually a lot of different universal truths applicable to different beliefs and worldviews just in that one image, isn't there?
Yeah.
That's a standout one for me. It was great fun to do visually, but then the more I've lived with it since we've finished the deck, the more I've started to sort of really question the breadth of its significance, but also particularly this year for me, because as I said, it has become real in a whole new way. So much so, I mean, one of the things, I mean, this deck was hideously delayed, wasn't it, because of the pandemic and all sorts of other complications. But the one good thing that came out of it for me is that, by the time we did have this publishing contract and we were ready to submit it, at least I was able to get that dedication in to the memory of my dad. This was the last big project that it was one of the last two big projects that he saw me working on. And he was so enthusiastic for it. He didn't pretend to understand it. I mean, my dad came from a very traditional Catholic background, although he wasn't sort of particularly, he wasn't practicing, but he was very open-minded. And as we were creating this, he was just really fascinated and just very encouraging every step of the way. So I would rather have a world where I still had him in it, but at least when this goes into print, that's at least it kind of does pay tribute to that, which is great. So yeah. So last one for today. This one is one of the more intriguing ones in the deck for me, and certainly one of the most powerful. So number 54, Clytius. And the keyword on this is defeat. Now, this is a figure that I hadn't heard of until...
And a lot of people don't hear of him unless they start doing a lot of sort of digging and research.
Yeah.
Because it's basically, Clytius was a giant. And there's basically like two wars in sort of, there's probably more, but the two main wars is you've obviously got the Titan War, where the Olympians overthrew the Titans, and then shortly after, because of obviously the fallout from it, you had sort of a giant war, and so Gaia produced all of these giants and sent them, off to war and stuff with the Olympians. And there is it's the statuesque or statuesque image that we've used. It comes from a frieze on the Pergamon altar, which depicts this battle between the gods and the giants. And this particular one, it shows Hecate sort of in profile, with, you can see sort of one of her faces, another one of her faces sort of facing forward, and she's brandishing the torch as a weapon, and beneath her, obviously some of it's been broken off over the years and stuff, but she's basically using these torches to immolate this giant who was identified in some of the literary sources as Clytius. So during the literary references of the war, it kind of gives you a blow by blow account of who killed who. So Artemis gets so many, and Apollo gets a few more, and Zeus gets loads, but then, let's say, Hecate is said to have defeated Clytius,
right?
And it got me thinking. Obviously, again, he was another symbol I wanted in the deck, and obviously, it's one of those really loaded terms, and probably not a card that you would react positively to immediately. I mean, a prime example of this is I took my prototype deck with me last year to attend a sort of a small gathering that Sarita d'Este was having in Glastonbury. And afterwards, I was just passing the deck around for people to see, and we were talking about it. And a lot of people, as they were looking, they were like, "Oh, can I shuffle it and pick a card?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's fine." And there was one person, and they picked out Clytius, and they reacted really badly. They were like, "Oh my God, no, not defeat." And I just kind of was like, "Yeah, but think about it for a minute. In this card, in this image, what we're looking at is Hecate's defeat of Clytius.
Yes.
And in a deck that's dedicated to Hecate, that will be used by Hecateans as well as other people, this isn't necessarily about you being defeated. This is about looking at what you have at your disposal in order to defeat whatever the challenge or obstacle. And that's where, when I mentioned with the Kerberos card about thinking about it from the other side of the word. And, we look at this figure in flames sort of in front of the goddess. And it's, although that's quite a literal human form, or, it could represent anything, it's more to do with the fact that the goddess is capable of allowing you to surmount any challenge and to come out on top. And obviously, you bring into things like the transformative element of fire, which crops up quite a few times through the deck because of obviously the torches, but also the fact that the torch in all the cards we've been using it as a, you know, as illumination. We've been using it as a sort of guiding tool. Yet here it's being used in self-defense, in offense, and, you know, as a weapon. And so it's about looking at things from a completely different angle rather than just taking everything at face value.
The keyword doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, the keyword is very important and it's central. But I mean, I've always seen this card very positively, because to me, I mean, it's certainly the most, it's one of the most powerful in the deck. I mean, certainly from a visual elemental point of view, it's, you know, it's really quite furious. But that's the key to me. I mean, you know, if this came up in a reading for me, you know, I'd immediately be looking at the obstacles that I was facing, thinking, well, yeah, I'm being given the empowerment to be able to defeat that. You know?
And that would be equally true if it was alongside, say, the Liana card for strength. If you get Liana and Titus, it's so obvious where that notion of defeat will lie, and it's, you know, it's not necessarily that you're being defeated; it's that you've got the strength to defeat something.
Yeah, I mean, it's for certain situations. I mean, the tarot portrays it beautifully. I mean, for me, everyone kind of fears the death card or the tower, you know, in the tarot. To me, that they're actually quite positive and constructive cards on so many levels. The one card that I fear the most is the Nine of Swords, because that's the one that, to me, talks about senseless cruelty, you know, and that, you know, there are certain situations in life which just are not fair or are not just. But, you know, I think if Colitis turned up with different cards, you know, then, yeah, you would be looking at your own situation and thinking, well, you know, am I defeated? But for the most part with this, I do see it as it's an empowerment card for me more than anything else. And actually, sometimes that empowerment itself can be quite scary, can't it? You know, because it can be a case of be very careful what you ask for, you might get it. But then, you know, you might find that you're being empowered to be thrust into situations that you've previously avoided and that you know, you don't want to be in. But once you're there, you'll have the strength to actually win through, you know?
Yeah.
So there we go, another 6 cards. So in fact, in the next video, we will be covering the final 6 cards, won't we? Which seems strange. So if you've been watching, we really hope that you've enjoyed being with us and following us on this journey. I've certainly loved revisiting all of these cards and going back through. So it's going to seem strange once we get to the final 6, but do join us next time. And yeah, thanks for watching. Take care.